The one who inherited the needle. Rosala passed the needle through the fabric once more and didn't raise her eyes when the church bell stopped ringing. Outside, the wind of the mountains of Michoacan came down cold among the pines. Inside, in that borrowed shack, the fire barely gave light. A skinny dog watched her from the door, without daring to come in. She didn't ask it to stay either. She just kept embroidering, as if the thread were the only thing still holding her up. Welcome to this channel, where the stories of the countryside remind us that the poorest heart sometimes keeps the greatest treasure. Stay until the end. This story is for you. Rosala was 32 years old and had hands that knew how to work miracles with fabric. She embroidered shawls, tablecloths, wedding dresses for the girls of the town. Her stitches were so fine they looked painted, not sewn. But no one paid her what her work was worth. "She's just a seamstress," they said in St. Anders. "A woman alone, without a husband, without anything." They paid her with a little corn, with a piece of cheese, sometimes just with a courteous word, and she accepted, because having work was better than not having it, and because idle hands weighed on her more than hunger. She had been left twice. The first time, a man who promised marriage and went north without returning, leaving her waiting at the door with an iron dress she never wore. The second hurt more. There were 8 days left until the wedding with Gennaro, the miller's son. She had embroidered her own dress for 3 months, stitch by stitch, in the early mornings, by the light of a candle stub. Each flower of that dress carried a sleepless night, a dream sewn into the fabric. That morning, in front of half a dozen women gathered in the atrium, Gennaro's mother raised her voice so that all would hear. "My son doesn't marry a starving embroiderer. Let her keep her threads." And she gave back to her, right there on the dusty ground of the atrium, the sack with the fabrics Rosala had kept for her new home. The fabrics fell and scattered in the dust, white, staining with earth in front of everyone. Gennaro said nothing. He lowered his gaze and let his mother speak for him. The women of the town saw it all. Doa Petra, the one who sold bread, turned around and pretended to arrange her basket. Another hid her laugh behind her shawl. No one picked up the sack. No one offered her a word. The silence of the atrium weighed more than any insult. Rosala bent down slowly. She picked up each fabric from the dust, one by one, shaking them carefully. She folded her wedding dress as if it still served some purpose, and put it away in the sack. She didn't cry in front of them. That she promised herself, with her back straight and her gaze held high. She would cry afterward, when no one could see her. She walked to her borrowed shack feeling on the back of her neck the weight of the gazes, and she knew, with a cold thorn in her chest, that in that town there was nothing left for her. That night she packed the little she had in her old trunk. A worn shawl that had been her mother's, earth-colored with an edge embroidered in red thread, the only inheritance she had left from her blood. A little wooden box with her needles and spools, her true treasure, and the skinny dog, which without anyone inviting it, decided to follow her to the darkest corner of the mountains. They had told her that up high, where almost no one went anymore, there was an abandoned shack next to an old sheep corral. No one claimed it. There she would go. Far from the town, from the gazes, from the pity that hurt more than the contempt. If God willed, there she could start over, or at least end in peace. She walked all the early morning with the trunk on her back. Her feet swelled. The dirt track went up, and her mother's shawl covered her from the dew. More than once she thought of sitting down at the side of the road and not getting up again. But the dog looked at her, waiting for her, and something stubborn inside her kept putting one foot in front of the other. When dawn painted the pines golden, she reached a clearing where a stone shack waited with its roof half caved in. The place smelled of damp and old wool. There was a collapsed corral, a dry basin, a rusted wood stove, a twisted mesquite giving shade to the door. But it had walls. It had a roof on one half. It was more than she had down below, in the town. Rosala left the trunk on the dirt floor and sat down for the first time in hours. Her cracked hands burned. She arranged the shawl over her shoulders, closed her eyes a moment, and let the silence of the mountains envelop her. It wasn't the silence of the atrium. It was a clean silence with no contempt inside it. What Rosala didn't know yet was that that shack wasn't as abandoned as it seemed. She had barely begun to shake the dust off the floor when she heard bleating. She went out and saw a flock of sheep coming up the ravine, and behind them, tripping over his own staff, a tall, gangly man who got tangled in an acacia branch and almost fell flat on his face. "Don't be frightened," he shouted, barely holding himself up with the staff. "The sheep are mine. Well, they were my father's. Now they're mine, I think." His name was Anders. He was about 35 years old, with large, clumsy hands and a way of speaking that stumbled just like his feet. He offered her water from his gourd and spilled half of it on himself. He wiped himself on his trousers, his hat fell off, he picked it up, and it fell off again. Rosala, for the first time in weeks, felt that something inside her almost smiled. "You can stay in the shack," he said, looking at the ground, not daring to look her in the eyes. "I sleep in the shed, with the sheep. I won't be a bother." He blushed to his ears. "I mean, it's not that I'm going to, you understand. Me there, you here. Each in their own place." Rosala looked at him carefully. She had learned to distrust the kindness of men. But in that clumsy shepherd there wasn't an ounce of malice. Only a kindness so clean that it tripped over itself. That night, Rosala slept under her shawl, with the dog at her feet and the distant bleating like a lullaby. For the first time in a long while, she didn't dream of the atrium. She dreamed of her mother embroidering by the fire many years ago, when she still believed the world could be good. The next morning, Andras knocked on the door of the shack so hard that he knocked a loose stone from the frame. "Sorry," he murmured, bending down to pick it up and hitting his head on the lintel. He brought a jug of warm, freshly milked milk and an egg. "I thought you'd be hungry," the hens laid. He left the jug on the ground. It slipped. He caught it in the air by pure miracle and laughed at himself. "I'm a disaster. My father always said so. Anders, you even trip over breathing," he'd tell me. Rosala warmed café olla on the wood stove that Anders had managed to light the day before, burning 2 fingers in the attempt. She offered him a clay mug. He took it with both hands, as if it were something sacred, and burned his tongue on the first sip, but said nothing so as not to complain. While he drank, he told her things by halves, like one not accustomed to talking. That his father had died last winter, of a chest ailment. That he had been left alone with the sheep and the shed. That almost no one came up to the town, and that he didn't go down much either, because down there they laughed at his clumsy way of walking and talking. "Up here the sheep don't laugh at you," he said, shrugging, "and the mountain doesn't either. That's why I stayed." Rosala listened without interrupting, recognizing in his words an echo of her own solitude. That afternoon, he showed her the place like one who shows off a house they love without knowing how to say it. He pointed out where the spring rose, when the frosts came down, which was the best mesquite for shade at midday. He warned her of the ravine on the other side of the clearing, deep and treacherous. Each thing he said tripping over the words. But Rosala began to understand that that clumsy man knew the mountains like no one else, and that he cared for them like a secret. So began the ritual. Each morning, Anders knocked on the door, dropped something, apologized, and left milk and an egg. Each morning, Rosala boiled kafte olla and served him a mug. By the third day, she already knew how much he liked his coffee, strong, with a piece of brown sugar. By the fifth day, he already knew that she preferred hers unsweetened. They didn't talk much. But the silence between them didn't weigh. It was a good silence, the kind that rests. Rosala took out her little wooden box and began to embroider again. Not for anyone, only so as not to forget who she was. She embroidered a tablecloth with mountain flowers, with agaves and birds, with the thread she had left. Anders watched her out of the corner of his eye while he mended the corral, driving the nail into his fingers more than once, and one afternoon he dared to come close. "That's pretty," he said. "Very pretty. I don't know how to make anything pretty. I only know how to count sheep and trip." Rosala raised her eyes. "Taking care of sheep is also something," she answered in a low voice. "And taking care of someone who arrives tired without asking for anything in exchange is something too." He stayed quiet, as if no one had ever told him that, and went off to mend the corral without turning his face so she wouldn't see his eyes. One afternoon, Doa Luca came up the ravine, a little old woman from the ranch below, with a basket of goat cheese and a bit of dough. "I heard someone had arrived," she said, sitting down on a stone to rest, with the shawl held tight against the cold of the mountains. "One shouldn't come up so high at my age, but my heart told me to come. And you have to listen to the heart, God willing." She left the cheese and the dough. She looked at the embroidered tablecloth and opened her eyes wide. "Child, this is the work of blessed hands. I knew those stitches many years ago. But that's another story." Doa Luca came back after a few days, and then again, always with something in the basket. Some eggs, a bunch of herbs, a candle. She sat on the same stone and told Rosala how the mountains had been before, when there were more people, more festivals, more hands working the wool. Rosala began to wait for those visits. She embroidered while the little old woman talked, and in the afternoons the shack no longer felt so empty. She gave Doa Luca a handkerchief embroidered with a yellow flower, just like the one Anders had left her on the jug, and the old woman kept it against her chest as if it were gold. That night, Rosala sat by the fire and, without meaning to, broke down. She cried for the atrium, for the dress folded in the trunk, for the man who went north, for all the years in which she believed she was worth nothing. The dog put its head in her lap and didn't move. And from the door of the shed, Anders heard her, but had the delicacy not to come in. He understood that there are pains that are tended to by leaving the person in peace. The next morning he only left the milk, an egg, and a yellow mountain flower on top of the jug. He said nothing. There was no need. Rosala took the flower between her fingers and for a moment had no words left. 3 weeks passed. The shack began to look like a home. Anders fixed the roof, crooked but firm, climbing up twice and falling once. Rosala embroidered cotton curtains for the window. The corral regained its shape. The basin filled when the rains came down. And below, in the town, the rumor began to run that the starving seamstress had gone to live with the clumsy shepherd of the mountains. Doa Petra told it in the market with a bitter smile. So dignified she made herself out to be. "And look at her," she said. But up there, neither of them knew it. And had they known it, neither would have gone down to deny it. One afternoon, while Rosala was cleaning the shack thoroughly, scraping years of soot from the wall next to the stove, she found a loose stone. Behind it there was a hollow. And in the hollow, wrapped in an old cloth, a tin box. But that night, Rosala was going to open something that had been waiting for her for more than 20 years. She called Anders. He came up tripping over the gate, as always, and entered ducking his head so as not to hit it again. They sat by the fire and opened the box together. Inside there was a very fine shawl, embroidered with a thread that shone like old gold, and a folded paper. Yellow with the years. Anders unfolded it with his clumsy hands, fearing to tear it, holding it as if it were glass. It was a letter, dated 22 years ago, signed by a woman named Engracia, and below, as witnesses, the name of Anders' father and the signature of the notary of Psquaro. He read it aloud, slowly, tripping over the difficult words, stopping to understand what his own eyes saw. Engracia had been a famous embroiderer throughout the mountains of Mechoacan. Her shawls were sold even in the capital, and the rich ladies paid for them what a cow was worth. In the letter, drawn up before a notary, she left it stated that that shack, the corral, and the lands of the clearing went to whoever continued her craft with honor, not to whoever had a surname or money. The one who inherits the needle inherits the house, said the letter, in so many words and with its seal. And at the bottom, a note from Anders' father. He had kept the secret for years, caring for the place, waiting for the right person to arrive, just as Engracia had asked him on her deathbed. Rosala held the embroidered shawl between her hands and recognized in the stitches the same technique her own mother had taught her as a girl. The mountain flowers, the birds, the red thread on the edge, identical to that of her own shawl. She felt a chill run up her back. Engracia had been her grandmother's teacher. Her mother had told her once, by the fire, like one who tells a legend without knowing it, following only the thread of her misfortune, Rosala had come up to the house of her own craft, to the cradle of her own blood. Then, this house, murmured Anders, is yours, truly, with a paper and everything, with a notary. He stayed looking at her with those clumsy, kind eyes. I only took care of the sheep while the one who had to arrive arrived. My father told me before he died to wait. That one day someone with embroidering hands would come up, and that on that day I would know. And I didn't understand what for. Until today. Something in Rosala's chest stopped hurting. For the first time in her life, someone was telling her, with a signed paper, that she was worth something, not for being pretty, not for being marriageable, not for being convenient, for what her hands knew how to do, those cracked hands that had been so despised down below. That same week, the rumor went down to the town transformed. Doa Luca, without bad intention, had told about the letter, about the shawl of gold, about Engracia's inheritance and the lands of the clearing. And then, those who had despised her wanted to come close, like flies to honey. Gennaro's mother came up the ravine one Sunday, breathless, with Gennaro behind carrying a basket of freshly baked bread like an offering. "Rosala, child," said the woman with a sweetness she had never had before, fanning herself with her handkerchief. Things were said in the heat of the moment. You know how one is loose-tongued. "My Gennaro always loved you, since he was a little boy. And look, now with your own house and your lands, well, a wedding would fix everything, don't you think? Let bygones be bygones." Gennaro took a step forward, with his hat in his hands. "Rosala, that day I didn't know what to say." Doa Luca, who was there helping to shell corn on the corridor, dropped the ear of corn and said aloud, in front of everyone, without getting up from her chair, how curious that the affection came to them just with the inheritance. Anders said nothing. He stayed back, next to the corral, with the staff in his hand, looking at the ground, as if he already knew he was going to lose, as if his clumsiness had no place beside a miller's son. Rosala looked at him an instant. Then she looked at the basket of bread that Gennaro's mother offered her with both hands. Then she looked, in her memory, at the atrium, the dust, the white dress staining on the ground in front of everyone. She spoke slowly, without raising her voice, with her back straight. When I had nothing, you threw the sack into the dust in front of the whole town. Your son didn't say a word. Doa Petra turned around. No one picked up a single fabric from the ground for me. She paused, and her voice didn't tremble. Now that I have a house, you bring me bread. Sometimes inside someone who seems defeated lives a dignity that money can't buy nor contempt take away. The woman opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Gennaro lowered his gaze, just like that day in the atrium, and put on his hat like one who looks for somewhere to hide. There were no shouts. There were no insults. They just turned around and went down the ravine in silence, with their basket of bread intact, while the wind of the mountains blew against them. Doa Luca watched them go and shook her head slowly. By Monday, the whole town would know how the seamstress had dismissed them without raising her voice, with more dignity than they had ever had. Rosala breathed deep. Her hands, which were trembling, calmed. She felt that something, at last, settled in peace inside her. Anders came over when he saw them disappear down the ravine. He said nothing about the wedding, or the miller, or the bread. He just picked up one of the ears of corn that Doa Luca had dropped and handed it to Rosala with his clumsy hands. You dropped this, he murmured, without looking at her, and in that small gesture she understood more than in all the sweetness she had been offered that afternoon. The one who had taken care of her never asked her for anything. The one who now wanted her back did it with a full hand. That night, for the first time, Rosala slept without the shawl over her shoulders, because the cold from within, the one that had accompanied her since the atrium, had at last gone. When spring came, the clearing in the mountains no longer looked the same. Rosala had planted a garden next to the basin, which now ran with clean water. And from the earth sprouted beans, herbs, flowers. The sheep grazed fat in the ravine and came back alone at dusk. In the window of the shack hung embroidered curtains that could be seen from afar, white against the stone, and the girls from 3 towns came up to commission shawls, tablecloths, wedding dresses, paying at last what they were truly worth. She had opened, without intending to, the workshop Angracia dreamed of, and the whole mountains began to call her by her name with respect. The shawl embroidered in gold thread hung on the main wall of the shack, in a wooden frame Anders had made with his clumsy hands, crooked on one side, but made with all his heart. It was the place of honor of the house. Next to it, Rosala had hung her mother's worn shawl, the 2 together, the gold one and the one with red thread, like 2 generations of hands that had at last found each other. One golden afternoon, Anders finished penning in the sheep and came over to the door, where Rosala was embroidering, making use of the last light. He got tangled with the dog, almost fell, caught himself on the frame with a slap of his hand. "Someday I'm going to learn to walk straight," he said, laughing at himself, shaking off the dust. Rosala left the needle on the fabric. "No," she answered, with a smile that was born from very deep inside. "Stay clumsy. That way I recognize you among everyone." And she smiled at him, a whole smile, the kind she hadn't given in years, the kind she believed she had lost forever in the dust of that atrium. Anders was left without words. The colors rose in his face. Then, very slowly, with those large hands that dropped everything, that spilled the water and hit themselves on the lintels, he took hers. He didn't fall. He didn't trip. For once in his life, he didn't fall. Sometimes inside someone who seems defeated lives the greatest love, waiting only for someone to dare to see it. And Rosala learned, now without fear, that the clumsiest person in the world can be the only one who knows how to hold you up without ever letting you go. And that home isn't the place where you were born, but the place where you were finally loved. Has someone ever believed in you just when you were beginning to doubt your own worth? If this story touched something in your heart, leave me a comment telling me from which corner you're joining us. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. And share it with someone who needs to remember today that their worth doesn't depend on who sees it or on what they have in their hands. Thank you for accompanying me with all your heart to the end. I already have another story waiting for you. That night, while the fire went out slowly and the two shawls rested on the wall, Rosala drew close to Andrus's ear to tell him softly the only thing she had been missing saying in all her life. I am from where they loved me. Opus 4. 8 High.